the ARIN side. Yeah, so the meeting is also being recorded because we think the insights that will be generated here today will be quite insightful. So without, and then if you have any questions or comments as the session is proceeding, please feel free to put that in the chat. And during the Q&A session as well, we'll pick some of the questions or comments from the chat. So I think without much ado, we can start. I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Kennedy Mbeva. I'm currently a postdoctoral research associate at the Blavatnik School of Government, University of Oxford. I am also a strategic advisor and a member of the advisory committee of the Africa Research and Impact Network. I'm very happy to see you all here, but also have the opportunity to facilitate the session today. So we have quite a packed agenda, so I think we'll get going so that we can make the best use of the time. So in terms of what we have planned today, we have a round of welcoming introductions. And I think because we have quite a big number here, we'll just save that for sort of. Could you please mute your microphone if you're not speaking, or the moderators at ARIN can help with that as well. Thank you. I'll also share a little bit about ARIN because today our topic, just to reiterate, our topic is about the think tanks, and ARIN is a think tank.
I think you're muted, Kennedy.
You'll also get an opportunity to hear sort of a little bit more about our speakers before handing the floor to them to share a few reflections with us. Each panelist will have around 10 minutes to share on specific topics or themes that are sort of tied to our topic today on think tanks and challenges. They're very experienced and they're very insightful, so we really look forward to their discussions. And then after that, we'll have a Q&A session where you'll get to ask your questions, and then we'll have an all-round discussion and everyone will get an opportunity to contribute. And then we'll have concluding remarks at the end of the session. So without much ado, I'll go to the next session, present about ARIN before we move to our distinguished speakers. So ARIN, Africa Research and Impact Network, we are a think tank that convenes and conducts research that is oriented towards supporting policy. There are a couple of thematic disciplines, which you can see on your left-hand side on sustainable development, climate change, energy, cities and resilience, agriculture and forestry, mining, trade and industry, technology and innovation. But we also have analytical approaches that underpin the research there. That's research in forecasting, thinking about future problems, policy analysis, convening and influence, capacity gap analysis and support, knowledge systems, business, financial models, and partnerships and strategy. So as you can see, there's a lot that is going on. So in very brief sort of overview, so it's a platform, of course, for researchers. We try to also connect peer learning among researchers, connect scholars across the various fields. We leverage knowledge towards Africa's excellence and also try to support transformative policies and research and policy thought leadership, which is very important. We have a strategic presence across the continent, and our ARIN has a devolved model of coordination where we have regional focal points. You can see there's East Africa, Southern Africa, Francophone Africa, and West and North Africa. And the whole point is to try and leverage the different unique contexts of each sub-region. We also have sort of academies that we run to support early career researchers. And as you can see on your right, we recently had an academy earlier this month on financing of NDCs under the Paris Agreement, and we had fellows from all over the continent. So the presence is quite strategic and tries to really connect the diverse and huge continent. As of today, we have a mentorship sort of session where we bring in people who are quite accomplished in their fields to get to share and engage with you. I've had quite a number of such kinds of sessions before. We also have more sort of thematic sessions, for example, on scientific publishing, etc., where we bring in scholars to engage with early careers. And we also cover quite a number of other topics. So in terms of convening such kinds of discussions, ARIN has been doing quite a lot in that space. There's also the point of or dimension of convening, where ARIN has done a lot of international and regional research and policy convening. And the point is to try and bring together the various kinds of stakeholders and the policymakers, researchers, practitioners, etc., people in the private sector, to try and think about some of the key or pressing problems in the continent, but also more importantly, to try and craft solutions that are quite practical. And the presence at the global level, including climate change events, but also at the continental level and building the different kinds of partnerships across the world. We also have convening in terms of academies and these targeting early careers, which is a very, very important dimension of engagement. And you can see, for example, earlier this month, as I mentioned, there was an NDC Finance Scholarship, which brought together almost 50 African policymakers and scholars to think about how we can scale up climate finance in the continent. There's also the Disaster Risk Academy, where 45 people were trained in terms of effectively responding to disasters. So it's a very practical approach, but also very much targeted. We also have sort of publications because we sort of are in contact a lot of research, and the different kinds of outputs that we have, including different kinds of global reports, such as on adaptation, state of trends in adaptation in Africa, but also at the global level, including work with the Global Center on Adaptation. ARIN also has sort of a book projects which really try to present cutting edge knowledge or ideas on some of the big challenges we're facing. And some of the books that are in the process of being published or sort of very close to being published. There's a book on Africa's right to development in a climate constrained world. There's a book on COVID-19 which documents the various kinds of lessons, and it draws on contributions from different kinds of stakeholders who have been working on COVID-related issues. And there's another book that is coming out later this year on decolonizing methodologies and how we can think about sustainability in a context that is very fitting to the global South and more specifically to Africa. So all in all, you can see there's a lot that is going on at ARIN, and so we're very happy to engage you in various ways that you might find as suitable to what you're working on. So feel free to engage. So I think switching gears and turning to the session today, as I mentioned, and to reiterate, we're very delighted to have a distinguished panel of people who have been leaders in their field, and we'll get an opportunity to hear from them, and they'll also get to share some of their insights. So I'll just give a very brief overview of each of the speakers before we turn to them to present. And I think we'll introduce each speaker or each panelist, and then they will speak for around 10 minutes, and then we move to the next panelist, introduce them, and they'll speak for 10 minutes or so. And once all the panelists have presented, then we'll have a Q&A session. So turning to the first speaker, Professor Alex Ezeh. Professor Ezeh is an honorary professor of public health at the University of Witwatersrand, South Africa, and holds an honorary Doctor of Science from the University of Ibadan, Nigeria, and KCA University, Kenya, and a doctorate in demography from the University of Pennsylvania, USA. He is the recipient of the World Academy of Sciences 2018 Prize for the Social Science, and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and the Royal Society for Tropical Medicine and Hygiene 2020 George MacDonald Medal. He initiated and directed the Consortium for Advanced Research Training in Africa and the African Doctoral Dissertation Research Fellowship programs to strengthen doctoral training and the retention of academics at universities across sub-Saharan Africa. Professor Ezeh's work focuses on urban slum health, population dynamics in sub-Saharan Africa, and models to strengthen knowledge-based institutions in Africa. His research has highlighted the development implications of sub-Saharan Africa's population and urbanization trends, underscoring the unique vulnerabilities slum populations face and defining the systems that best serve slum populations. He has also ensured slum populations become more visible in national and global reports and data systems. So without much ado, then I'd like to invite Professor Ezeh to speak for around 10 minutes. And I will let you know, Prof, at the 8-minute mark, and just give you maybe 2 minutes to conclude, so that at least we have more time for discussions later on. So I'll hand over the floor to you, Prof, to share your insights on some of the things you've been working on, but also the sort of the insights that we can draw on responding to things like the pandemic and building sort of the role of think tanks in developing the kind of knowledge that is relevant to the scale of problems such as the pandemic. But I'll leave it to you also to steer the sort of the presentation to your discussion. So over to you, Professor.
Thank you, Kennedy, and thank you for the invitation to share with our early career researchers and some of these important conversations. I'm not sure whether this is the first in the series of these dialogues and mentorship convenings, whether there's been so many of them in the past. I do trust that our early career scientists and researchers will grab this opportunity and in some ways really interact with the people that you've brought on the panel today and in every other opportunity that you create. I do hope you will be able to ask thoughtful questions to the panelists to understand where they are, where they're going, and also your own place and career within this space. You know, if you think about think tanks and their challenges in Africa, I do not think there is any lack of publications and documentations of challenges and problems in Africa or in African institutions or among Africans, that we do not have a lack of those. There's a huge amount of material, and any one of us can speak for hours on the problems. What oftentimes the challenge has been is finding practical solutions to many of those problems and actually taking the type of action that we need to make a difference. These problems stare us in the face, and if you live or work in Africa, you face them every day, you see them and all of those. So as an early career researcher, I think what's really important is how we can support you to make a difference within this space, irrespective of the constraints of institutions and the environment in which you found yourself, that at the moment in time we are in creates a unique opportunity for you to be able to make a big difference. Many of you may have known me from my initial work and career at the African Population and Health Research Center. When I decided to step down from being the director of the center in 2017, my goal was to help develop tens or hundreds of similar organizations across Africa. And the first thing I did to start that process was to really try to understand the challenges and opportunities for institutional development in Africa. Part of that desire to work within this space, which was quite new for me then, we're looking at 2017, 2018 to now, was the fact that was actually based on my experiences at the APHRC. First was that, you know, I can't tell you how many times people walk up to me and ask the question, how many other APHRCs are there in Africa? And when they ask that question, you can interpret it in many, many different ways. But what I understood it to be is that How many other African-based, African-led institutions out there that do work that is globally recognized and that brings together Africans from different language and nationality and regional groups to one place to really address African issues and questions? But there were other experiences and things while at APHRC that actually motivated my interest to move in this direction. One of them was an experience with a particular funder who came to APHRC. And while at APHRC, we had very great conversations and discussions. And at the end of it, I was seeing the person off, and the person turned around and looked at the APHRC campus and turned back to me and said, "Oh, you don't need help anymore." I was startled for a moment and I thought, then I turned around to the person and said, "You know, Harvard has maybe $38 billion in endowment, that if you stopped funding Harvard today, in 10 years, you will not recognize the institution. That the model of development we've had for Africa has been that of offering a helping hand and finding where the problems are, and we can be saviors of it and all of those. But when you think of development differently, you will think of where you get the greatest mileage and impact with the dollar that you're spending. You want to invest in success. You want to identify organizations that are at the tipping point of really breaking through to becoming global institutions in whatever they do and supporting them to get through there. But that is contrary to the models of development that we have used and approached, the way we've approached development in Africa. And I can tell you the history of development in many different parts over the years, both their foundation and their history and the orientation is definitely around those. It's not about building strong and sustainable institutions in many ways. So those conversations led me to begin to think, what are the issues to institutional growth and development in Africa? What challenges do leaders of these think tanks face? Why do funders have difficulty, and what difficulties do they have in funding African institutions? How do we change these dynamics and all of those? And you can read the report we wrote at the Center for Global Development, cgddev.org. You put in my name there, Ezeh and Lu, and you will see the report on strengthening African institutions. That outlined a lot of the issues, but more importantly, offered practical solutions and suggestions on what could be done to strengthen institutions and think tanks across Africa. Our conclusion, if I will paraphrase that, was that we needed to change the funding model of African institutions, the way institutions in Africa are funded, starting with strengthening domestic investments in research and development by both public and private sector institutions in Africa, not externally driven. But we need to start from domestic investments, and almost every country that has made significant progress in developing their societies have invested domestically in research and development. And so there is no way for us to compete in the global knowledge economy without this basic reality of domestic investments in research and development. But also, we talked about the fact that we need to rethink the scale of investment that is needed to drive transformative change in Africa. Why is it that when we think about funding African institutions, we think in the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands and millions? We need to move that scale to billions of dollars and tens of billions. That's what it would need to create the type of institutions that will position Africa to become part of the global economy, knowledge economy that we are currently experiencing. And to think about it, why is it surprising to think of the 54 countries across the continent with 1.4 billion people that $5 billion in research investments a year is such a big undertaking? Johns Hopkins University in the US, its annual research budget is at least $3 billion. So it is not out of sync to begin to think of the scale of investments that are needed, but we cannot expect it to come from outside. We need to provide leadership within those. And we also need to, the way that the development in Africa has been structured is that you have the global space and you have the national space. And almost everything that happens in between at the regional level is driven and directed from outside of Africa. And so you have the spoke and the wheel, with all the spokes connecting to the wheel, but not connecting to each other in some ways. And that's part of the challenge of knowledge institutions in Africa, is that we do not know how to partner and collaborate with each other. I think the 2014 World Bank report suggested that 78% of the research publications in East and Southern Africa were done in partnership with partners outside of Africa, and only 2 to 3% are with other African partners. That needs to change. We need to invest in ways that facilitate brain circulation within Africa, to connect the expertise that we have across our various countries and regions and bringing them together to really address the problems and the challenges that we have. The issues we have in Africa are shared commonly across countries. They do not know national boundaries. And many of our countries are so small that it is impossible to have thriving knowledge centers and institutions within those. But by coming together, we can do a whole lot more than we're able to do on our own. So the funding model and all that we think about needs to be able to catalyze this cross-circulation of knowledge and researchers and scientists across the continent. In the 4 years since 4.5 years since I left APHRC, we have made significant progress in thinking through this, and we are hoping that within weeks or months that we will be able to hear more about the outcomes of this, and particularly with regional institutions like the African Development Bank being able to step in and provide the platform to realize many of these things. But these are the type of conversations that we need to have within the think tank space and knowledge institutions on the continent. I was requested to share some reflections on the role of policy-oriented research in future pandemic responses in Africa. And for me, I think the basic point to make here is that you do not start to dig a well when your house is already on fire. If, COVID-19 has been so kind to Africa, the next pandemic may not be as kind. And we cannot wait for the next pandemic to begin to address the issues and points that I am raising today. The time to build and strengthen institutions and knowledge institutions in Africa is now. The time to transform the funding landscape for institutions in Africa is now. We cannot get there when we continue to ship our best minds outside of the continent because we cannot provide them the right environment to develop their full potentials. We cannot get there when we depend on external funding as the primary instrument for financing research and knowledge innovation on the continent. And we cannot continue to say we do not have the money. Yes, we have physical constraints, we have financial constraints, and COVID has amplified that in many ways. It has also shown us that if we remain where we are and complacent in investing in this area, there is no way for us to continue to be relevant within the global knowledge system. So when you think about preparing for the next pandemic, my sense is that the only way we can do that is to start today to invest in our institutions. It's not just about paying salaries of people in universities and research institutions. It's about investing in the work that they do. And my sense is that if we can do that, then we'll be able to transform our institutions in ways that they now become solutions or solution-oriented to the real challenges and problems we face in Africa. I work in health, and I like the lots of resources that come into health research in Africa. But health is not the only problem we have in Africa. We have problems with energy, with, in education system, in social issues and things like that. So we need to find ways to begin to address those things from our own perspectives. They say it's that the person that wears the shoe that knows where it pinches. And if we are able to make those levels of investments within our institutions, I think we can find the solutions Africa needs to move forward. And my thing is that that's where we need to be. And those are the types of conversations we need to be having today. Thank you, Kennedy.
Thank you, Prof, for really sort of opening the conversation in a very strategic way and actually framing some of the key points that we need to tease out. And I think the really good points that you bring out, number one, like the model of funding is very important. And number two, the issue of scale. How can we collaborate across the continent to rise above these issues? And even perhaps more importantly, the issue of digging a well when the house is on fire. I think that's a really appropriate metaphor in terms of thinking about the problems that we have. And as you mentioned, not only in health, but also the kinds of shocks we're experiencing in the continent due to many events within and outside the continent. And I think that sets the scene very well for our next speaker, who actually would speak about the aspect of support and engaging with think tanks and from an international perspective. And Dr. Ellie Osir holds an MSc and a PhD in biosciences from the University of Arizona, as well as postdoctoral training at the universities of Washington and Harvard. Currently based at IDRC's regional office for Eastern and Southern Africa, Dr. Osir manages research projects on science, technology, and innovation, and leads IDRC's work on Science Granting Council's initiative in Sub-Saharan Africa. He works closely with councils, universities, research organizations, and non-governmental organizations to support the application of STIs in ways that are economically progressive, socially responsible, and inclusive of less privileged social groups, such as women, the youth, and marginalized communities. Prior to joining IDRC, Dr. Osir worked at the International Center of Insect Physiology and Ecology, ICIPE, as a principal research scientist on the applications of biosciences to address various plant, animal, and human health-related pests and diseases. His work led to over 60 publications, a patent, and an international award. While at ICIPE, he supervised 23 MSc and 21 PhD students from all over Africa. He served as a board member of the National Biosafety Authority and Consortium for National Health Research. He was a council member of Kaimosi Friends University College for 3 years. He also served as a visiting adjunct professor at the Center for Biotechnology and Bioinformatics, the University of Nairobi, for a period of 5 years. So Dr. Osir, perhaps you could pick up the conversation from where Professor Ezeh left and unpack for us a little bit based on your insights on the aspect of support for supporting the next generation of think tanks in Africa to be able to address some of the big challenges. So the next 10 minutes are yours, Dr. Osir.
Thank you very much, Kennedy. And thanks a lot also for the invitation. This is my first time to attend this this discussion series. So thanks so much. I will speak very briefly the topic, even if I don't focus necessarily on the areas of support. And I'll also just switch off my camera just so that I can be able to use the screen. So thank you very much. Okay. Like you said, my name is Ellie Osir, and I work for IDRC International Development Research Center, the office in Nairobi, Kenya. So I will just speak more to the issues around what I see as opportunities as well as challenges for these types of organizations, what we call think tanks. And I will start off by telling you a little bit about IDRC, very, very briefly, by saying that IDRC champions and funds research and innovation within and alongside developing regions to drive global change. We invest in high quality research in developing countries. We share knowledge with researchers and policymakers for greater uptake and use. We mobilize our global alliances to build a more sustainable and inclusive world. As some of you may know, IDRC was founded in 1970 with the funding from the government of Canada. We continue to receive funding from the government of Canada through annual parliamentary allocations. And this funding to IDRC from the government of Canada comes through what we call Global Affairs Canada, or GAC envelope. Apart from the office here in Nairobi, we have offices in Montevideo, Uruguay. We have another office in the western part of the continent, Dakar, Senegal. The office for Middle East, North Africa, Middle East is in Amman, Jordan. And in Asia, we have an office in New Delhi. The headquarters is in Ottawa, Canada. So IDRC recognizes the critical role that actors such as organizations play in science or knowledge systems. And it is in this context that IDRC supported the think tank initiative for 10 years. I'll come back to that in a minute. But just to start off by saying that IDRC has had a very long history of supporting the development of think tanks as well as research organizations, particularly in the 70s and 80s, when creating new organizations was very much fashionable. And in fact, some of you may be aware that IDRC played a critical role in the founding of many of the CGAIR centers across the world, particularly ICRAF in 1978, ICADA in 1975, and CIAT, and even ICRISAT, and many others, together with the World Bank, UNDP, and other global funders. IDRC also supported the establishment of a large number of research organizations across the world. As you may know, the interest in establishing new organizations is not as it was in those days. And I think organizations, funders such as IDRC, are now looking for other models for organizational strengthening rather than creating new organizations. So that's just a trend, that I wanted to share with you. So back to the think tank initiative. I think this one is very important to kind of recap on this one, because I think it will give us some ideas about what we see as the role of think tanks in science knowledge systems. So think tank was launched in 2008, and it was in existence for about 10 years, up to about 2019, 2020. The funding came from IDRC, Bill Melinda Gates Foundation, UK FCDO. It wasn't called FCDO then, it was called DFID. The William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, NORAD, Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation, Netherlands Directorate General for International Cooperation. So there are about 5 or 6 donors that came together to fund the think tank initiative. And the idea of think tank initiative was to strengthen the capacity of independent policy research institutions or organizations in developing countries by providing co-funding. So it was a bit of a unique model, I have to say, because like I said, initially in the 70s and 80s, funders were very keen to provide co-funding. By co-funding, I mean unrestricted funding. But as we all know, co-funding has been going down, and most funders are keen on providing project or program funds. So that's what's happening now. It doesn't mean that that there are no funders that provide co-funds, but I'm just saying that the appetite for that has gone down somewhat. So the think tank initiative funded up to 43 independent organizations in 20 countries, working in Latin America, West and East Africa, as well as South Asia. So it was a very ambitious initiative. And the idea was to support these organizations to attract, retain, and build local talent, develop independent research programs, invest in public outreach to ensure that research results inform and influence national and regional policy discourses. So it was, the intentions were quite good. And some of you may know that some think tanks in our region here received support through that initiative, like KIPRA, Institute of Economic Affairs. There's also research on poverty alleviation in Tanzania, REPOA, Science, Technology, Innovation Policy Research Organization, STIPRO in Tanzania, and so on and so forth, and others in Uganda. There's a large number of think tanks that received this co-funding support. So I think I'll just stop there in terms of background and just talk about what we see as opportunities. What are some of the opportunities? I'm sure there are many, but so I'll just mention a few from a perspective. Number one, I think think tanks have a great opportunity to conduct goal-oriented research, particularly research that address both local and regional development needs and interests, because think tanks are locally based and embedded in areas where those problems exist. There's that opportunity that they'll always be called upon to address local issues where this is necessary. For those think tanks that are independent, I think this is very important because it ensures that think tanks can provide independent advice to the government, and I think this is very useful. Think tanks, I think, have a lot of opportunity to influence policy and practice in their context, and I think this is something that we can also list as a great opportunity. As we all know, many funders prefer think tanks because they are usually smaller. The funders think of them as being more efficient because of that, or as a result of that. So the think tanks, I think, are positioned very strategically to receive funding from many donors because of their very, very narrow focus, and also the fact that they're smaller organizations with smaller overheads. Funders are very concerned about overhead costs. I think think tanks have a great opportunity to nurture talent, and this is something that we should not lose sight of, and it is something that will continue to be a concern of think tanks, and I think think tanks can take advantage of that to, how do we build capacity and nurture talent as we move forward. There are also some challenges, nevertheless, and some of these challenges we have learned from the think tank initiative, as well as other initiatives that IDRC has supported in the past. And I'll speak to some of them, not all. And then I wanted to finish by reflecting a little bit on think tanks in Asia. was based in Asia for about 8 years, so I worked a lot with think tanks in that region. So to me, I think the biggest challenge that think tanks face is the issue of funding and how that funding can be sustained. And I think one of the biggest challenges is depending on donor funding. And I think, Alex, you did mention that issue of over-reliance or reliance 100% on external donor funding. And again, as we all know, few think tanks have endowments. So this becomes a challenge if on an annual basis, we depend on external funding. If that funding was to run out suddenly, then there would be some problems. And in fact, I remember there was some financial assessment of some think tanks. I can't mention which ones, but that financial analysis did show that quite a number of think tanks were actually, their finances were not in very good shape. That's another way of saying that they were deemed to be insolvent, but nevertheless ongoing concerns. So it is a serious problem. The second one is limited staff, and I think that relates to the first constraint, the first challenge. Of course, when there's limited funding, there's also issues of being able to hire and retain competent staff. So if you look around for some think tanks, you will find that some of them is just, you find that there's just one key person and some support staff, which is not a very good situation. Many think tanks have systems of finance and administration that are relatively weak. And as you know, many funders, before they will provide funding to an organization, they will look at the financial systems, the admin systems, and so on. And when that is done as part of due diligence, what comes back is that these organizations are rated as very high risk, because of weak financial systems. The other challenge, I think, is working in isolation, and we know that many think tanks will just work in isolation rather than kind of working together, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So those are just some of the things that we learned from the think tank, but also from previous work. But so what are the solutions? I mean, what are some of the possible solutions? This is something that we've been discussing at IDRC for quite some time. How can we support think tanks? And one of the suggestions that has been floated around is the idea of voluntary mergers of some think tanks. I think some think tanks are, like I said earlier, just very, very small, and it might be a good idea for some of them to consider joining others, particularly if they work on the same space, coming together with others voluntarily to merge into one legal entity. The other solution that we've been discussing is forming networks. There's also a possibility for think tanks to form networks so that they can bid for large projects. If you're a slightly medium-sized organization, you can, with a lot of competent staff, you can bid for a large project. But if somebody wants to provide, let's say, $1 million, and they find that there's just 2 people, then there are concerns about, whether this organization can actually manage those funds. Or if the budget of the organization is only, let's say, 2 million, but you want to give them a project of 5 million, you see, it doesn't quite come together in that sense. I think it is also very important for think tanks to improve their financial systems. This is very important for donor funding, as we all know. It is also important to be able to engage highly qualified personnel. Of course, you have to have funds to be able to engage highly qualified personnel. So what comes first, chicken and egg? So you need people to be able to convince funders to provide money, but to get people, to have people, you need funds. So I think the idea is innovation. What kind of innovations are possible to allow think tanks to, to be able to access funding. So now, just to wrap up, let me share some experience from Asia, particularly Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia, that whole region of Southeast Asia has a very large number of think tanks, but they have a slightly different model. We have independent think tanks, but they also have think tanks that are linked to specific ministries. So for example, if you go to China, you would find that the Ministry of Agriculture has a think tank that is very much linked to it, but kind of semi-autonomous, but linked to the Ministry of Agriculture. So it's like each sectorial ministry has a think tank, and I think it really helps. And when I was working in that region, we would normally work with the think tank that's linked to a particular ministry. So for example, we worked with the China Center for Agricultural Policy Research based in Beijing. And that think tank was linked to the agricultural ministry. In Vietnam, for example, we did a lot of work with the Vietnamese Ministry of Science and Technology, but the engagement was through something called National Council for Science and Technology Policy. So you see that it was a kind of think tank that is, that's linked to that particular ministry. So these entities, they are semi-autonomous, like I said, and they operate like parastatals, like our parastatals here in Africa. Of course, this arrangement has pros and cons, but what we learned was that the think tanks that were linked to ministries had greater success to influence policy. So you see, there is an advantage of being independent, but when you're independent, you may not be able to have the same the same possibility of influencing policy directly compared to when you are linked to a particular ministry and working with them in that sense. And I have to say that in Asia, the way they view these organizations is very different from the way we do here in Africa. I should also say that those think tanks, even though they were linked to the ministries, they were also receiving external funding, and hence why we were able to work with them as IDRC. So this is a model. I mean, I know that here in Kenya, I hope I'm right, but I think KIPRA is partly a system like that, although perhaps it is not specific to a given ministry, but it serves different ministries. Over there, you will find that each ministry, health has a think tank, science, technology, or education would have a think tank, agriculture, and so on and so forth. So it was a very interesting model. The advantage, obviously, is that these think tanks were receiving government support, so they would get some co-funding from the government, and then they can raise external funds. So it is just another model that we need to think about in Africa, in addition to the independent think tanks that we have. So thank you very much. Those are the few remarks I wanted to share, and also to apologize that I'll not be able to stay much longer because of a conflicting meeting that's starting shortly. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, Dr. Osir. I think that was very, very interesting presentation, and it was very enlightening, especially your final sort of point on the kinds of models of think tanks that could be there. For example, the Asian model, which is quite insightful. So, and you've also raised some really good questions, which our next panelists will tackle. But thank you so much for your time and sharing your insights. We really appreciate your contribution. So I think we can now move to Professor Ngila, and I think some really good themes have come out of the previous presentations. And Professor Ngila is currently the Acting Executive Director of the African Academy of Sciences since July 2020. She provides leadership and strategic direction of the AS, programmatic and operational management, whose vision is to transform lives in Africa through science. The AAS's tripartite mandate, this A, recognizing excellence through the Academy's highly prestigious fellowship, affiliates, and award schemes. B, advisory and think tank functions for shaping Africa's science, technology, and innovation strategies and policies. And C, implementing key STI programs addressing Africa's developmental challenges. Professor Ngila is a former Deputy Vice Chancellor of ARIN University for Academic and Student Affairs, a former Deputy Director of the Institute for Oil and Gas under Kenya Pipeline Company, in charge of training, academic programs and linkages, and a visiting professor at the University of Johannesburg, University of Nairobi, and Masinde Muliro University of Science and Technology. She has worked at the University of Johannesburg, University of KwaZulu-Natal, University of Botswana, and Kenyatta University. Professor Ngila is a fellow of the World Academy of Sciences, a fellow of the African Academy of Sciences, a member of the Academy of Sciences of South Africa, a member of the African Academy of Sciences mentorship programs, was co-chair of the 2021 Commonwealth Science Conference, which was held in February, and a mentor for MasterCard Foundation, a member of various chemical societies and professional organizations. I don't need to add anything to that. You can see Professor Ngila is very distinguished and draws from a sort of a rich experience. So Professor Ngila, perhaps I'll hand the floor to you, and as you shape your contributions, perhaps at some point you could touch on the kinds of capabilities, scientific capabilities that Africa needs to address some really pressing questions. Over to you, Professor Ngila.
Thank you very much for hosting me. And well, unlike my previous presenters, I like to talk to slides in case sometimes I overloaded the slides, so I just pick the points that are important. But thank you very much for inviting me. Clearly, obviously, because when we look at the role of the African Academy of Sciences, which I'm going to cover very briefly, one of the tripartite mandate is the think tank function. Where the academy provides think tank functions for the continent because it's a Pan-African organization. And so I would be looking at some of the, and of course, talking to the title, strengthening Africa's scientific capabilities to address pressing challenges. And of course, given the role of the African Academy of Sciences in terms of its vision, first and foremost, is to transform lives through science. So obviously, then we have to look at how do they do that? How do we achieve the transformations? So that basically that is just my concept. And of course, as a professor, I've got interest in, I'm a chemist, applied chemistry, water research management. A visiting professor. I worked at the University of Johannesburg for quite a while, as you introduced, and currently visiting professor at the University of Nairobi, and also Masinde that you explained. I would like to cover the background of the African Academy of Sciences and also look at some of the strategic planning in terms of implementation of our vision, that is transformation of lives, and through leveraging of resources by the think tank resources that we usually have. And also looking at some of the issues in terms of what is the role of the African Academy of Sciences in terms of research agenda setting, and how do we assist institutions in research management in African institutions, so forth and so on. Open science is one of the areas right now we are talking about because of the fact that we know that most institutions in Africa do not even have access to journals. And so therefore, how does the African Academy of Sciences? And then also I would like to, as we go towards the end, I would like to pick one of an example of partnership between European Union and African Union in terms of their cooperation, but how the African Academy of Sciences is implementing some of the programs for the continent and basically just the framework of how this is happening. We talked about the vision of the AS. I said it is for transformation of life through science. And the mission is to leverage resources through research excellence and thought leadership. And of course, AS is only Pan-African Academy. Of course, we have got national academies all over. NASAC, which is Network of Academies of Sciences in Africa, coordinates all the academies. But the African Academy of Sciences basically deals with individual researchers. So currently about 600 professors, professionals, researchers, so forth and so on, who are members, who are fellows of the African Academy of Sciences. And we have implemented programs, through AUDANEPA, that is African Union Development Agency, a new partnership for Africa's development over the years, and delegated by the African Union to implement some of the priority areas of the Agenda 2063. And talking of the academy, of course, we are non-aligned, non-political. So sometimes, like, for example, recently, the issues, the conflict that has been taking place between Russia and Ukraine, we were called by so many people to say, make a statement, particularly our media. We said, no, we are non-aligned, non-political, not-for-profit organization. So individuals can make individual, but me as the executive director of the African Academy of Science or the president of the academy cannot make a statement, because it will be construed to mean that you are talking on behalf of the academy. I talked about the tripartite mandate of the African Academy of Sciences. Recognition of excellence is very, very important through the election of fellows, but also some of the grants that we are giving. When you look at the criteria, we are trying to target the cream of cream in Africa, so that whenever we give these grants are utilized properly. And then I talked about, of course, Alliance for Accelerating Excellence in Science in Africa finished its first cycle from 2015, and we are waiting for African Union to give us a go-ahead if we are going to continue with this platform. But basically, majority of the projects that we have been able to implement, we have implemented through this platform, which was agenda setting, business planning, and so forth and so on. And we've got different thematic areas, climate change, health. So in other words, all the fellows that we have belong to different subject areas. And it is because of this diversity of different subject areas that we can talk about think tank functions in terms of policy papers, white papers, and so forth and so on, what is happening on the continent going forward. So some of the goals of the AS through the platform that was agenda setting and business planning was one was to build R&D leadership, and we have done that through the a lot of funding that came into the AS, coordinating for the whole of Africa, supporting innovation and entrepreneurship, and also looking at early career researchers, very, very important, targeting critical areas, like, for example, we're talking about COVID is just more or less coming to an end. Now we have got monkeypox. So we have to think about how researchers should be able to position themselves in terms of readiness for Africa to tackle some of these challenges that we have. So the role of the AES in terms of strengthening Africa's scientific and capacity in terms of addressing 2020 is, let me first look at the situation analysis, what is happening in Africa in terms of research. So we're talking about Africa spending less than 1%, about 0.45%. Maybe the statistics are a little bit, maybe they were 2020, so maybe the numbers are increased a little bit, but that is the range we are looking at, 4.5% of the GDP on research and development. So how is research going to transform the continent, really, if we cannot invest adequately? And if you try to compare, you compare with the target for African Union, it says that all African states will be able to invest about 1%, but we are still very low. And when you look at the global average, is about 1.7%. But also very important, when you look at Africa, you say Africa accounts for 12.5%, I think it is 16% maybe now, of the global population, but it produces less than 1% of global research. So these are areas that we really have to, look into. And we are also looking at the total share of the contribution of the, about 7.6% in terms of international publications. But of course, when you are comparing with the population, then you see the number is low, but that has increased. In fact, what we are trying to say, the third bullet is simply saying, despite all these numerous challenges that Africa has, it has improved over the last 10 years in terms of the total percentage in terms of contribution to the world publications. And of course, continues with the statistics that Africa has got less than 100 researchers per million people, compared to the global is about 1,100 per million people. So again, we are almost 10 times less than what we should be able to do. So what then is the way forward? Africa must increase this investment in R&D. Of course, I've had my previous colleagues who have spoken, Professor Ezeh, Professor Dr. Osir. Everybody is simply saying, first, let's put our efforts together first as Africa institutions, as Africa governments and all that. Before we take a ball to go and start begging, let's first see what can we do in Africa. So we have to support cutting edge research, basic research. Of course, basic research leads to applied research, it leads to innovation, it leads to commercialization, and of course, transformation for that particular. So we have to empower African researchers going forward, particularly looking at SDGs. Now, if you look at the Africa context, we see that climate is really a serious problem to us. Obviously, there is a lot of argument that we are simply saying that even though it's somebody else polluting elsewhere, we are suffering the consequences of climate change. Food insecurity is another issue. About 124 million people in 51 countries experience high level of food insecurity, according to FAO. Poverty, we cannot continue. So the story continues, and we know all these stories very well. So how does AS implement science and technology and innovation? We have done that over the years, of course, for the continent by building R&D, which I talked about, innovation and all that. Some of the programs that we have been able to fund under the different goals, which is building research and development infrastructure, innovation and entrepreneurship. Also nurturing the early career researchers, emerging researchers, and also looking at the critical gaps that continue to arise because these are emerging particular issues. So we have been able to fund various programs like, for example, the Delta programs, HR3 Delta programs, Grand Challenge programs. These are different programs that we are aimed at whether it is we are building R&D, whether you're trying to achieve innovations, like for example, transition to scale. You've got an idea, you have proved the concept. So can we give you money so that you go towards innovation and entrepreneurship? So these are the kind of thinking that has been. And what is expected then of the rising careers? Because rising research leaders is where we are trying to tap. And of course, we want them to be world-class research and innovators. They should be able to manage financial, management grants that you are getting. You must be able to manage them. Individual professional growth, the networks, you must be well networked and supervise students, institutions, grant management, and so forth and so on. So, and these are different areas. Now, what is the role of the AS in terms of the research agenda for Africa? And we are simply saying that it's a continental policy and education research through its fellows and also its partners. Resource mobilization is one thing that we continue to to engage in terms of trying to look for opportunities to apply for funding so that we can give this research grants to different African researchers in African institutions. Investment to improve infrastructure. Some of these keywords are coming up again over and over again, but also networks whereby intra-Africa networks as well as global South, global North networks. Mentorship is always one area that we continue to progress in. Gender and science, these are areas that we have got committees that have to discuss. How do we increase the number of women, for example? If you look at our statistics, you realize that women fellows are still less than 20%. And then the question then is, what is the African Academy of Sciences doing to make sure that women are taking a bigger seat in terms of being fellows, elected fellows, and so forth and so on. Issues that we continue. And of course, the role of the AS in terms of the unique role it plays as a Pan-African organization continues to, I talked about some of these points. Some of the areas in terms of improving research management in African institutions is we advocate that collaboration within African institutions and also external institutions, building capacity, evidence-based benchmarking, Africa leadership supported by global expertise, building on existing structures. For example, you invest in terms of infrastructure for you to be able to carry out research. And of course, looking at a long-term approach to research management. But some of the independent or interdependent variables is simply, there has to be, we have to put institutional leadership, very important, because imagine institution is given money, and that money is not, well, the leadership in that particular institution does not see, the urgency of allowing the researchers to do research. So transformation of the thinking, the thinking of the institutional leadership is very important. Long-term commitment by these institutions, high quality standards, individual capacity building, those are some of the pillars that we have to. Now, the AS has got a program, we call it a good financial grant practice, whereby whenever you get a grant by the AS, and it's not necessarily when you get a grant, you can also apply to be your institution to be to be evaluated, assessed, so that you get sort of a grading to say that you are at this level, you need to go to the next level in terms of a good financial grant practice. So we do run that program at the AS, and more so for those institutions where we get grantees that are being funded through the AS by international organization. I talked about the Open Science platform, whereby I think this is very, very important for Africa, given that many institutions cannot afford to have updated libraries, they cannot access international journals and so forth and so on. But however, because of the cost of maintaining the platform, we've got this platform at the AS, which is supported by a UK company called F1000. We only allow the fellows who are fellows of the AS and also affiliates, as well as the grantees that are funded through, so that we can be able to manage, because otherwise the AS does not have its own money. We can invest in some of the overheads that we get, but the money is not so much. So it is going to be too costly to say the whole of the continent, please, free, you can publish using our open access. That is not possible, because financially we'll not be able to manage really to do some of those things. So some of the recommendation going forward is that we talked about infrastructure, very important. Collaboration is also very important. Funding mobility, so that young researchers can be able to see what other institutions are doing, particularly well-established institutions. For those who are doing natural sciences, laboratories, I'm a chemist, so I would want to go to a chemistry lab that has got all the instruments that I want to use for my research, obviously. And I've talked about the global that. Enhance the capacities for emerging researchers, strengthening institutional research, and so forth and so on. How do we implement that? And I've talked about workshops, conferences. This platform by ARIN is also very important, because it creates awareness of the people who are listening to these presentations, meetings and trainings, and of course, policy in Africa. Having workshops of policy discussions, so that we can be able to see how to improve on them. I want to go into the details of the EU-Africa, European Union, African Union partnership, but I just wanted to mention the recent summit, 2017, 2022 also. They have been focusing on green economy transition, digital transformation, sustainable growth and job creation, peace and governance, and migration and mobility. Now, this partnership is trying to promote these particular areas between cooperation between EU and AU. And quite a number of things that I've talked about, I've highlighted the green transition and so forth and so on. But it's basically one of the examples. But what is important is how AS has been able to be given one of the programs to manage, and that is a program that I wanted to talk about, in fact, going forward. That is a program, because I know time is really not on our side, but I just wanted to give you this an example of this program that we are running. So 2021, starting of 2021, the AS received about $30 million to implement a program called ARISE, that is Africa Research Initiatives for Scientific Excellence, which is funded by European Union through the African Union. And it is to broaden, the objective is to broaden and strengthen Africa's science base. And what we are doing is that this money, we advertised, according to the grant competition, we advertised it to the whole of Africa, but the target was 40 researchers in 40 different countries. This is the first time ever that we have received money at the AS to fund Africa and so many countries. After we went through the criteria and so forth and so on, we managed to get 44 researchers, but some of the countries did not make the mark because meritocracy is very, very important, even though you want to spread the whole of the continent. But if I give you the money and you don't have the capacity and the track record for you to use that money, obviously, then that is wasted. So anyway, we ended up with 44 researchers. Some of the countries have managed to get 2 researchers, not just 1. Of course, South Africa, as usual, had so many, about 300 applicants, and we needed 1 person. Kenya also had a big number of applicants, and we only needed 1 Kenyan. Anyway, so we ended up with 38 countries. Some of the countries fall out because of the quality of the applications that we received, but at least we have been able, we'll be able now to fund, and we're actually able because we have already given grant letters, and they should be starting these projects towards the end of May. Going towards June, where now, the funded researchers now can go to the lab and do the experiments. But it was not just for natural sciences. We also had people, some of the applications that we are looking at, digitalization of the institutions, and looking at how to enhance teaching, for example, using virtual platforms and so forth and so on. And so the specific objectives of this particular grant is the capabilities of emerging, to enhance capabilities of emerging African researchers, to strengthen institutional research management, because when you get one researcher is getting about 500,000 euro. If I talk in terms of Kenyan shillings, is about 70 million. And so therefore you can buy equipment, you can be able to recruit students. Particularly we said that 2 PhDs and 4 master's students, you must. That is one of the conditions. So that is one of the game changer programs that the AS is trying to manage, because we are empowering not just the individual researchers, but the institutions through the infrastructure improvement of those institutions where the research is coming from. So I've come to the end of this, and let me just quickly stop that. And then I've got so many slides. So, normally I package slides for different topics, but so I pick what is relevant for that. But let me just stop there briefly. I wanted to give one of the examples of, I've worked in South Africa, and I've benefited from the National Research Foundation type of grants, whereby they support, promote, and advance research, human capacity development, national research facilities, where it is a central facility where institutions, researchers from different institutions in South Africa and other African countries can go to those centers. For example, Itemba Lab, it has got state-of-art equipment. So that is a model in South Africa that I would have wanted every single country in Africa to embrace, because I've seen the benefit of the NRF, which is funded by Department of Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation. Now they call it Department of Ministry of Science and Innovation, so forth and so on. So that I just wanted to share my experience with South African National Research Foundation. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Professor Ngila, so much. And I think my takeaway, at least from that presentation, is we've heard of challenges of setting up and running think tanks in Africa, but also you've shown us there are quite a number of opportunities for researchers, especially early career researchers, to sort of connect with and engage with. And perhaps, given that you had so much to share, but the time is really pressed, maybe that's an opportunity for us to look for another it's an excuse for another opportunity at some point, maybe where you could sort of have more time to share some of the insights that you have, but also some of the opportunities. So
thank you.
I think we'll follow up with that with
Sure.
Dr. Ateva. So last but not least, we'll sort of turn to Professor Cosmas Ochieng to give us just a brief overview of or share some of his insights on the role and the place of African think tanks in the global arena, given that he's worked in several leading think tanks and actually led them. So Professor Cosmas Milton Ochieng is a global development and environmental specialist. Prior to joining the World Resources Institute, he was the director of the African Natural Resources Center at the African Development Bank in Abidjan, Cote d'Ivoire. Cosmas has held teaching, research, and policy positions in a number of think tanks, universities, international organizations, and NGOs. These include Boston University, Lancaster University, Africa Center for Technology Studies, International Union for the Conservation of Nature, International Food Policy Research Institute, ActionAid International, Eco-Agriculture Partners, and International Institute of Rural Reconstruction. Cosmas holds a DPhil in Development Studies from Oxford University, an MPhil in Development Studies from Cambridge, and a BA from Kenyatta University. So over to you, Professor Ochieng, but also feel free to steer the discussion the way you'd like. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kennedy. Hi, everyone. It's nice to see so many friends, some of whom I've not seen in quite some time. So thank you very much. So I have the gift of speaking last, but also the curse of speaking last. I mean, I do realize this should be a conversation. So you can't spend 90 minutes listening to 4 people and then you walk away. I don't think that is what ARIN would like. So I'll try to, I'm readjusting this as we speak, but I'll try to make this very quick, but hopefully productive. So my friends here asked me to maybe speak to the evolving role and place of African think tanks in the global research arena. I apologize. I don't think I will do any such thing, in part because it's a very complex subject. We are talking about African think tanks. I think we know what we mean, but there's quite a variation there. And because we are actually, I've looked at the people attending, most of us are think tankers, so we are talking to ourselves. So I actually wanted to challenge ourselves. So I will approach this as a citizen of Africa and what I would like to see an African think tank do. What, as a citizen of the continent, I think the place of an African think tank should be. So I will be speaking from that perspective, but also drawing on my experiences, having worked in think tanks with some of what we are calling challenges and opportunities. I will do this, I think, by making 3 propositions, and hopefully not hopefully, I'm determined to do this fairly quickly. So most think tanks have, if you will, a party slogan or their reason for being. And that is that policy is too important to be left to governments. That's why they get involved. And it is true, because policy is often contested. Best ideas do not always win out. Sometimes it's not even clear that good ideas get into the policy process. So think tanks really have a role in sort of helping broker a variety of views and evidence. And if they're effective think tanks, getting that into the policy process. But that's not actually my primary concern. My primary concern is if we accept that premise, that policy is too important to be left to governments, and therefore other players and other voices, including by think tanks, are needed in that process, then African development policy, broadly defined, whether that's economic policy, whether it's science policy, whether it's health policy, is really too important, first, to be left to governments, and secondly, to donors or international organizations. Because we are playing catch up in the development process, there is always a temptation to think that whatever challenges we have, other people have had. So there's always a temptation to rush to, okay, this is the way this was done there. Can we import it to the African continent? There's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but we wouldn't know if we didn't subject that proposition to rigorous criticism and look for alternatives. And I'll come back to this point. I think even some of the problems that we face with the think tanks in Africa, and Ellie alluded to this, is, in my view, we moved too readily to borrow the model of a think tank from outside and try to transplant it into the African context without really grounding it in the African realities. So I say this because if you look at, in my view, the best African think tank in historical perspective, it has been those think tanks that have aspired to be a leading analytical voice on issues critical to Africa. Whether that was health policy, whether that was science policy, whether that was economic policy. They've been those think tanks that have aspired to be thought leaders on issues that were critical to Africa. So if you look at Codesria, for example, under Shomir Amin or under Tandika Mkandawire, led the debate on what is the appropriate development model for Africa and really challenge development theses that were being proposed internally and externally, okay? Or even in terms of trade policy. So I think like Siatini, and Ayashtandan or Tralak, these were organizations that were really keen to play a leading analytical role in that space, projecting an African reality on the subject. And I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that if you're looking at science policy, for example, obviously the work of my colleagues at AAS, ATPS, ACTS, and of course, if you're looking at reproductive health and population, the work that Alex has done. Now, these think tanks did not merely, and I'm generalizing here because of time, these think tanks do not merely seek to provide evidence to inform policy, although they did that in spades. In most cases, they were actually trying to either influence the agenda or set the agenda, or even disrupt the agenda. And I would like you to think about that for a moment. So we all work, or at least we work with think tanks, so you know how hard it is to actually influence policy, just sort of even climate policy or whatever policy. Now, imagine if you can set the agenda or even disrupt the agenda. If that is your aim, and if you can successfully set the agenda, you would earn yourself a place at the table. In other words, people will not, it will be very hard to ignore you, whether they like you or not. And that is one way you begin to address some of the challenges that we have. Because if you are setting the agenda, people will engage. So part of the challenges that the think tanks in Africa have is this lack of recognition or limited recognition or the proof of concept. Do governments have the trust and confidence in the research? Would they come to you for advice in the first place? Or even donors, or even the private sector. But if you are, so yeah, speaking to you as a citizen of the Republic and where I think African think tanks should be, not that, and I'll come back to this point, not that there's anything wrong with informing the agenda, but sometimes when you inform the agenda, you operate within the status quo. And you're not really bringing in anything new. Remember, policy is too important to be left to governments. So if you're just sort of operating within those parameters where the government is, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. It's just that if we don't subject that to serious scrutiny, we would never know whether there were alternative and better ideas. All right. So I think, at least as a citizen of the Republic, as a citizen of the continent, that given where the continent is, there's a real place for African think tanks to play the thought leadership role. And obviously not just in terms of generating the research, but also even in terms of advocacy. So I started by saying that there's diversity among African think tanks. That's actually true. There's so many, some are Pan-African, some are local, but there is also, in some ways, in a very strange way, a lack of diversity or even imagination in the way African think tanks are set up. So in terms of thematic areas of concern, in terms of the genre, in terms of the tactics. So Ellie also alluded to this from in some way. So we don't, for example, have, say, think tanks affiliated with political parties. And you might ask, why is that important? In other words, we all don't have to be the same. So if we are really interested in influencing policy and setting the agenda, we would all benefit from having political parties fund some think tanks so that the party positions will be rigorous. So even when you disagree with them, you're actually disagreeing with some ideas. There's a real sort of exchange of ideas. We've also not sufficiently engaged the private sector in Africa. So I'm generalizing here, but there's been a general tendency among African think tanks to concentrate on a very narrow set of policymakers, normally just the executive and normally at the central government level. So we don't even sufficiently engage the legislature, for example, or the judiciary, or subnational level. But more importantly, we don't really seek more broadly to influence public opinion and private opinion. So there are many ways you can actually change, or even if you want to influence the agenda or set it up. Obviously, you can work with the policymaker directly, but if you change public opinion on the subject, then the policymaker will follow the public opinion. And you can also change the private opinion. So we, as specialists, I think, although there's a lot of diversity, there's so many think tanks in Africa, we tend to do more or less the same things, focus on the same areas, adopt the same organizational models, so that we sort of face the same challenges. And there is perhaps really some vast room for improvement there, I think is what I should say in the interest of time. Maybe the final proposition, I think, I won't go through the others. Maybe the final proposition I would make as a challenge to you, and there's a reason why I'm speaking as a citizen, because I know if I was speaking as a think tanker, I would actually have very serious arguments with some of the propositions I'm putting forward. So I'm not saying there's one way of doing this. I think we've actually lacked sufficient diversity in the way we've been doing this, and therefore limited perhaps our scope and influence. So obviously, if you were sort of following that very brief I was having there, my proposition is that African think tanks should be in the business of really setting the African agenda, not informing it, setting the African agenda. And if we cannot set it, then disrupt whatever agenda is there that we think is inconsistent with African development needs. Now, if you're in that space, that will actually determine the kind of a think tank you're going to be. So if you seek to set the agenda or to disrupt it, i.e. you disagree with the agenda. So if you set the agenda or to disrupt it, it is fundamentally going to determine the kind of think tank you will be. So you will need to look for people that are either, or persuade people. So this is the influencing the public opinion and public and private opinion. Your target audience would probably be much broader. And you will sort of seek alliances and maybe potential funding from ways that might be more non-traditional or more non-conventional than the ones that we've been used to. And that leads me to the three so-called, they are real challenges, but I actually don't see them. They are challenges, but I think the challenges for the private sector. So for us, for the think tanks. So the challenge of really limited recognition or the proof of concept, either the governments or that people don't take us seriously, maybe say the way somebody takes the Brookings Institution in the US or Chatham House in the UK. So this sort of lack of recognition thing. And the challenge of lack of financing and the challenge of lack of staffing. It is easy to sort of blame other people. So it is easy to say that African governments don't care about research or evidence. Maybe that's the case. I think maybe that might be the case everywhere. But the entire point of a think tank, I think, is to overcome these challenges. So this is where the enterprising spirit and the creativity sort of comes in. And I'll go back to the more successful or the successful think tanks in African history. Some of the ones that I mentioned. One was actually initially funded by through a $20,000 grant. So it's not so much the money, or there are different ways of actually looking for this money. We have a lot of African billionaires now. We don't even have to look for billionaires. There's a very large African middle class, and actually African think tanks have been successful in conducting research that has sort of demonstrated the power of the African middle class. But the African think tanks have actually not harnessed that middle class as a conduit or a catalyst for change. So where was I going with this. Yeah, we sort of, where was I going with this? Just a second. So if we're in the business of setting the agenda or disrupting the agenda, that really changes the type of think tank that we're going to be and the kind of people that we are going to target. And I would say most of the things that we present as challenges, to me, I think we have never seriously approached them as maybe symptoms of our own failings as think tanks. And I'm speaking as someone who actually ran a think tank and didn't do what I'm saying now. This is sort of the lesson I have learned since then. So, for example, in this meeting, which is a really good one, I can't see a private sector person. Maybe if I'm missing them, I'm sorry, or policymakers. We don't see when we hire people, we don't hire former ministers or former permanent secretaries into think tanks. Even though sometimes actually they hire from think tanks and we go into government and we don't come back. If you want to sort of enhance your credibility as a think tank, and if you are really sure about your purpose, you want to set an agenda, it's important for you to have people within your team who actually knows how a government works, for example. And there's nothing stopping you from hiring former government officials or former private sector officials, so, or even finding mechanisms of engaging those people. So variations of fellowships, for example. The final thing I would say in terms of reaching out to perhaps different funders, I was very surprised when one of the days after I came to them and I was asking him why African, say, billionaires are not typically interested in funding think tanks. And he told me, nobody ever asked me. Nobody ever asked me for the money. I won't give you the money while I'm still alive, but I would be very happy to leave it for you in my estate. And actually, at that time, I thought that was a joke. And then I happened to have attended an Africa philanthropy meeting where most of these billionaires coalesce. And that's a real proposition. A number of them are very keen on working either to create endowments or actually to leave their estates to, if there is a think tank working seriously in an area of interest for those people. So I think this, what I'm sort of trying to do is to giving you the benefit of my experience and some of the things I actually considered challenges, which now I accept, were in some ways just symptoms of my own lack of imagination. In part because we have operated within a conception of a think tank that is largely borrowed, and we haven't subjected that to quite rigorous analysis of what really in the African context a think tank should be or can be. Sorry, I went over more than I wanted to go, but I hope that is helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ochieng. It's actually quite helpful because you've offered a very fitting conclusion to the panel discussion, with a very robust critique and giving us a lot of food for thought on how do we even think about the role of think tanks and also ways of mobilizing resources, etc. So as you mentioned, I also have really the incredible difficulty of having to wrap up a very interesting conversation, but it won't be a conversation without engagement from the audience. So the good news is there's been a very good conversation in the chat. Thank you, Professor Ezeh, for responding to many of the questions there. So perhaps we can take one very quick round of introductions, and if our panelists could just allow us to sort of exceed by just a few more minutes to take one quick round of questions, and then we can conclude. So does anyone have a question? Please just unmute your mic and ask your question. Otherwise, most of the questions in the chat have been answered. Great. So seeing no one is taking the floor, but I think there's been a good conversation in the chat, then I'll take the chair's prerogative and ask the panelists, maybe for just 1 minute reflection on concluding remarks, where to next. If there's one thing, one wish you had that you wish could be granted based on the discussion today, what is that one thing? So maybe just a minute concluding, and we'll move in reverse, in the order that we had Professor Ezeh, Professor Ngila, and then Professor Ochieng. Just a minute each as we conclude. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. I think a lot has been said today, and in the chat, one of the questions that was raised there is conversations that we were having there is about being able to say no to money. And I picked that up because many of our institutions appear to struggle with money. We tend to grab anything that comes, irrespective of what direction it takes us. And nothing can be more damaging to a think tank than to follow the money and not your ideas and your mission and where you really need to be. I can tell you initially, it might be uncomfortable, and even your colleagues might think, are you crazy? How can you have $1 million on the table and you're walking away from it? But the more of that you do, the more you create a reputation around yourself and your institution about what you are about. And people come to respect that. And when they then engage with you, they engage with you differently. So I can tell you that when I was at APHRC, that's one of the things that we started, even when we had nothing. Can't tell you how many people came around with £1 million, $2 million contracts, and all of those. Said no. It's either it's out of scope for us, or maybe it will take us 20% more to do that. So we are going to be spending the limited resources we have trying to pursue an agenda that is not ours. And at the end of the day, you really get nothing. I think being able and having many more African think tanks recognize the power of being able to say no to money can be so liberating in terms of what you do and what you're able to do. The second, I think, in the 1 minute that I have, is just to say that especially for the young early career researchers to whom these sessions are targeted, you have an incredible opportunity. There's a lot of the battles that we faced, you don't have to face them now. Nobody will question whether you as a think tank in Nairobi can pay your staff with PhDs from top global institutions anything more than the University of Nairobi is able to pay its academic staff. I mean, those are the basic little simple fights that we have to go through. I think we've created a foundation, and the work that several people and leaders in this space have been able to do. You can stand on that and do a lot more. And I would say that engaging with the diaspora has to be something we need to think about carefully and create space within our own institutions for them to play a role. I think we oftentimes, again, I love what Cosmas said about, speaking to ourselves, and we need to be able to speak the truth to ourselves in order to move forward. Sometimes we are our worst enemies in many ways, and inability to create that space for others. I tell you, maybe I will end with this point. Do not be afraid to share your ideas. Even if other people steal it and move and run with it, it is okay. There are many other wonderful ideas where that came from. Find others and move with them. The most important initiatives I have been associated with are things that we were willing to let go and to ask others to take on and to do. And as you discussed it and shared it with many different groups, it begins to crystallize in your own mind the potential that is in that idea. I can tell you that the best thing you can do to yourself and to your career is to be generous in being able to share your ideas, being able to support others, being able to, and that's the only way we can grow this space within our continent. And I just want to encourage you, if you have the opportunity to partner with another think tank in Africa, don't think twice about it. And if you have that opportunity, treat them better than you would treat another think tank, because we need each other to be able to make a difference in this space. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ezeh, for that very provocative, but also very insightful conclusion, saying no to money, but being bold as well and sharing your ideas. So Professor Ngila, what is the one thing we should take away with from this conversation today?
I think my takeaway message is going to be very biased because I'm a natural scientist. And for me, I feel that for any researcher to actually be able to say, I can publish in reputable journals, I can be able to come up with a prototype so that it can go towards the level of commercialization and all that, it is very, very important for governments to prioritize investment in infrastructure, to improve institutions, strengthen scientific capabilities, focusing on institutional leadership, very important, individual capacities, quality in terms of the standards that we must be able to uphold. And this obviously, I like to look at the nexus of education, research, and innovation. I know that it is not always research in terms of academic research that gives us innovation, because somebody can just sit down and say, this telephone, I can change this telephone to something else that is going to be more maybe user-friendly. And so therefore they might, but for that person to say, I want to change this telephone, they must have done research to understand the weaknesses of the current telephones. So in other words, still, I want to use the nexus of education, research, and innovation. Thank you.
Professor Ngila, and I think that point of innovation is very well taken. So again, last but not least, Professor Ochieng, can you give us one last gem of wisdom as we conclude? Professor Ochieng. Okay, so I think we've, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry. So see the challenges as opportunities. Don't actually look for opportunities. Seek to address the challenges, because that's where the opportunity is. So the lack of finance, the lack of resources, that is the opportunity. Sort of seek to overcome that particular challenge. Don't look for any other opportunity. That challenge is the opportunity. And in the broader context of this, the key ingredient lacking in African development is not lack of money, it's not any of those things, it's ideas. So going back to Alex's point, that is the key resource lacking in our own development. That is not going to come from anywhere. It's going to come from here. So the development challenges that we face, see those as opportunities as well. So for me, the challenges are the real opportunities. Start from there and how to overcome them, including the challenges facing the think tank. So think of those as opportunities, think creatively, and look for innovations on how to overcome them. Rethink the funding model, rethink the staffing model, rethink the credibility challenge or the recognition challenge. So sort of the challenges are the opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ochieng, for that very positive conclusion. And I think everyone has taken up the challenge of thinking, in a creative way and not getting stuck with thinking about challenges. So I've come to the end of our discussion. And I think for me, this is the beginning of a very important discussion that we should continue having. And my suggestion to the organizers would be, as we go ahead, I think it will be very important to perhaps we can organize a session with each of the panelists today to have where they'd have more time to actually elaborate on the very important points that they've raised. Maybe that's something worth pursuing. So thank you all for your time. I think I'll just hand to Johannes Atela to thank Dr. Taylor, to thank our panelists as we conclude. Over to you, Dr. Taylor, and thank you so much, panelists, and thank you everyone for your time. Over to you, Dr. Taylor.
Thank you very much, Kennedy. And I know time has gone. So mine is just to take the opportunity to thank our distinguished panelists. I think we have had a really very exciting points, some really thought-provoking perspectives, which I think is very important. And as Kennedy says, this conversation really needs to continue. It's not something we can basically finish in a one-off kind of engagement. So from the Africa Research and Impact Network, we are going to ensure that we create spaces or opportunities through which we can basically continue to talk, because the challenges, as you had, that is facing the African continent, not just research, but even developmental trajectories, are actually complex, and it's through such discussions that we are able to begin to think about some of the innovative solutions that our panelists have also highlighted. I just want to also take the opportunity to also encourage the many early career researchers in this forum to be able to engage quite strategically with some of these panelists. I know a number of them personally, and one thing I want to say is that there's a huge opportunity for you to learn a lot from them. So take the opportunity to reach out to them and continue the engagement as we try to create the next generation of leaders for knowledge in Africa. And finally, I just want to say that the questions that have been raised are really monumental. And I think one thing that continues to remain very fundamental is the element of how do we work together as think tanks? How do we create a platform or spaces where as think tanks we can be able to, begin to confront some of these issues collectively? How do we create a think tank forum where we can basically, of course, as Prof. Ochieng says, we talk to ourselves, but we can also begin to talk to other people. And I want to agree with Alex that really talking to ourselves is very important, because we begin to tell ourselves the truth. And some of these truths are really underlying. And I think the moment we open up and accept that there is a challenge that we need to address collectively, that is basically the beginning of transformation in Africa. And so this is very important. And from the Africa Research and Impact Network, we are very passionate to really work with all the think tanks and partners, of course, both in this forum, but also elsewhere, to be able to create a consolidated sort of front for Africa's knowledge champions, especially the think tanks. So think about ideas like the think tank forums. Think about the ideas around partnerships and linking the different think tanks together, which I think is something that has been raised quite fundamentally in the discussion. Is we don't talk to ourselves, we don't partner with each other, we work in isolation. We replicate the same kind of models that all of us are kind of pursuing. And so, as Prof. Ochieng puts it very clearly, that we end up facing the same kinds of challenges and the same kinds of problems that then impede our role in terms of setting the agenda. And I do want to believe that it's only through coming together, it's only through creating these particular spaces that we are going to either set the agenda or disrupt the agenda. We need to set the agenda around the funding models for think tanks. Osir mentioned about how they are basically trying to rethink about the funding perspective or the funding approach. But the big question is, where is the place of think tanks in terms of setting that agenda in terms of telling the donors that, look, this is really what we think is aligned to the African context. This is what we think speak to our circumstances. So we need to work together. And again, as Kennedy says, I'm personally very passionate that we're going to reach out and try to get something out of this process. And if we can collectively do that, I think then some of these challenges, are going to be handled, and we begin to see the beginning of a real transformation in terms of think tanks as sources of knowledge, and also as sort of platforms that play really very fundamental role in the policy transformation, not just policy transformation, but also the practice that basically responds to the Africa's developmental agendas. And with those few remarks, again, I want to take the opportunity to thank our able panelists, but also thank the participants who have been very patient since the beginning of the discussion. And I want to again reemphasize that this is just the beginning, and we are going to talk more, we are going to engage more, and let's really work together for the betterment of Africa, and of course for the betterment of our next order of leaders in the knowledge systems of Africa. So thank you very much again, and back to you, Mary.
Great, thank you everyone, and I think at this point we'll conclude and we'll get in touch with future opportunities. And thank you, our panelists, very much.
Thank you.